The night Damien Vale told the world my baby wasn't his, the ballroom went so quiet I could hear the ice crack inside crystal glasses. There were more than 300 people in that room, all dressed in silk, velvet, and money. Senators, investors, society wives with diamond bracelets that flashed every time they lifted their champagne. A string quartet was playing near the marble staircase. A giant screen behind the stage showed photos from the Vale Foundation's annual charity gala, smiling children, hospital wings, scholarships. Cameras drifting over polished wealth like it had been blessed by God himself. And there I was, 7 months pregnant in a deep blue gown, one hand under my belly, smiling politely because that was what I had learned to do as Damien's wife. Then he took the microphone. At first, I thought he was about to thank me. He'd done that before. He liked the image of a devoted husband standing beside his glowing pregnant wife. He liked the applause it brought him. He liked anything that made people admire him. So when he called my name and asked me to come stand beside him, I smiled and walked toward the stage while half the room clapped. But when I reached him, he didn't take my hand. He stepped back, and in a voice so calm, it sounded rehearsed, he said, "Before this night goes any further, I think there's a lie that needs to be dragged into the light." People laughed, nervously, thinking it was a joke. I looked at him and saw something in his face that froze my blood. Not anger, not pain, certainty. He turned toward me, lifted his chin, and said, "Tell them, Alina, tell them whose child you're carrying, because it isn't mine." The room swallowed itself. I remember the first thing I felt wasn't sadness. It was confusion, so sharp it made the edges of my vision blur. I thought maybe I hadn't heard him correctly. Maybe he had said something else. Maybe the baby had pressed against a nerve. Maybe I was about to faint. But then the whispers started. Chairs creaked. Someone gasped. I saw Celeste, my mother-in-law, sitting at the front table in a silver gown, one elegant hand resting against her lips as if she were shocked. But her eyes were not shocked. They were satisfied. Damien kept staring at me. "Go ahead," he said louder this time. Or should I explain why my wife suddenly became so protective of her phone, why she disappears for private appointments, why my own doctor confirmed I have almost no chance of conceiving naturally? A few people near the front turned to look at my belly. That was the moment humiliation became physical. It felt hot. It rushed up my throat and into my face and made breathing difficult. My baby shifted inside me as if she could feel my panic. I finally found my voice. "Damien, what are you doing?" What I should have done before marrying a woman who mistakes kindness for stupidity. There was a murmur at that, ugly and eager. I saw flashes from phones. Someone was recording. Of course they were. Wealth loves scandal almost as much as it loves charity. "I have been patient," he continued. "I have overlooked too much. But I will not have my name, my family, or my children tied to another man's mistake." "My children," he said. Not ours. My knees almost gave out. And for one terrifying second, I thought I might fall right there in front of everyone. But I stayed standing because something inside me refused to let them watch me collapse. I put both hands around my belly and said, "The only true thing I could say, this baby is yours." He laughed. Not loudly. That would have been easier. It was a soft, disgusted laugh. The kind a man gives when he thinks he's looking at something beneath him. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded document, and held it up. "My lawyer has already prepared a petition for prenatal paternity, testing, and immediate financial separation." The quartet had stopped playing. Every eye in the room was on us. Not one person moved to help me. I searched the crowd like a drowning woman searching for shore. I saw Sabrina, Damien's assistant, standing near the bar with a solemn expression and lowered eyes. I saw Vanessa, his ex-wife, and mother of his 3 children, one red nail pressed against the stem of her glass. I saw board members, reporters, donors, and strangers. I saw people who had eaten at my table, hugged me, congratulated me, and smiled at my ultrasound photo 2 hours earlier, all of them waiting to see how hard I would break. "I won't do this here," I whispered. Damien leaned closer, though the microphone still caught every word. "You already did this here. You just did it in my name." Then he straightened, looked at security, and said, "Mrs. Vale will be escorted home. After she surrenders her event credentials, Mrs. Valet, not Alina, not his wife." A security guard approached me with the expression people wear when they are embarrassed by their own obedience. I stared at Damien, hoping, even then, even after that cruelty, that something in his face would crack, that he would see me shaking. that he would remember the nights he fell asleep with his hand on my stomach, talking to our daughter as if she were already in the room, that he would remember the miscarriages before this pregnancy, the tears, the prayers, the way I had almost stopped hoping, but all I saw was pride. Cold, polished pride. So I took off my bracelet with the event pass attached. I placed it in the guard's hand. I lifted my head, and I walked out of that ballroom with 300 people staring holes through my back, while behind me the silence broke into the hungry sound of gossip. That should have been the worst moment of my life. It wasn't. The worst moment came an hour later when I reached the front door of the penthouse I had lived in for 2 years and discovered my fingerprints no longer opened it. There are certain kinds of pain that announce themselves loudly. A slap, a scream, a coffin lowered into earth. But the pain of realizing someone planned your destruction quietly, carefully, in advance, is different. It doesn't strike all at once, it unfolds. At first the locked door, then the call to the doorman, who avoided my eyes and informed me Mr. Vale had changed the access authorization. Then the text from Damien's lawyer. Temporary relocation has been arranged for you pending paternity determination. Your personal belongings will be delivered after inventory. As if I were dead, I stood there in heels, in that blue gown, with mascara drying under my eyes and my baby pressing hard against my ribs. And for the first time that night I understood. This had not been a spontaneous accusation. It had been built, prepared, organized. Damien hadn't lost control in a moment of anger. He had made a plan, set a stage, invited an audience, and humiliated me on purpose. I called him straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I called Celeste because even though she had looked pleased in that ballroom, a desperate part of me still believed another woman, another mother, would not leave a pregnant woman out on the street. She answered on the second ring. Mrs. Vale, I said, hating how formal my own voice sounded. I need to speak to Damien. There was a pause, then her voice, smooth as cut glass, I think tonight, made his position very clear. You know, I didn't do this. She sighed the way rich women sigh when they're forced to acknowledge unpleasant reality. Elena, let me offer you the only mercy available. Stop fighting. If the child belongs to someone else, take what dignity you have left and go. My hand tightened around the phone. You think I cheated? I think women from modest lives can become dazzled by larger ones. And sometimes, when they realize they can't truly belong, they create leverage. I actually stopped breathing. For a second, not because I had never seen Celeste's cruelty before. I had, but never so nakedly. Never without the lace gloves she usually wore over it. I loved your son, I said. No, she replied. You loved what standing beside him turned you into. Then she hung up. If you had met me before all of this, you might have thought I was the kind of woman who would shatter under a blow like that. I was soft-spoken, careful, patient. I taught music therapy to children recovering from trauma at St. Anne's Hospital. I was the woman who remembered birthdays, who carried extra snacks in her purse, who knelt to tie untied shoelaces even when I was wearing heels. I had grown up in a small house with a widowed father who fixed radios for neighbors and told me that gentleness was not weakness, it was discipline. I believed people could be reached if you met them with enough steadiness. I believed love could make hard people kinder. I believed marriage was a place where two people protected each other. By the end of that night, most of those beliefs were bleeding on the sidewalk. What saved me was an old woman named Agnes Flores, who lived 3 buildings away and had once delivered half the babies in the neighborhood before she retired. She happened to be in the lobby visiting her sister when she saw me sitting in a chair near the doorman's desk, pale and trembling, a silk shawl slipping off one shoulder and a suitcase I didn't have resting nowhere because I had been denied. Even that much. Agnes recognized me from the free prenatal music sessions I had volunteered to run at the church annex. She did not ask for details. She looked at my face, looked at my belly, and said, "You're coming with me." I started to refuse. Pride is a ridiculous thing. It survives in people even after dignity has been stomped flat. But when I stood, pain tightened across my abdomen, hard enough to make me gasp, and Agnes grabbed my elbow before I could fold. So that was where I went the night my husband threw me away. Not to a luxury hotel arranged by his lawyer. Not to a friend from his social circle. To the 1-bedroom guest suite behind a retired midwife's house, where the sheets smelled like lavender and the tea tasted faintly of cinnamon. Agnes sat me at her kitchen table, wiped my face with a warm cloth like I was a child, and listened. I told her everything, or almost everything. I did not tell her that Damien had once been the safest place I knew, that when we met, he had looked at me with a tenderness so focused it made the rest of the room disappear, that I had not intended to fall in love with a wealthy divorced father of 3, that he had pursued me, not the other way around. I did not tell her how carefully I had loved his children because I knew what it meant to lose stability young. I did not tell her that I had carried 2 pregnancies before this one and lost both, and each time Damien had held me and cried into my hair. I could not fit those memories into words yet. They hurt too much, Don. Instead, I told her what mattered. For survival, that Damien believed I had cheated, that he wanted a DNA test, that he had locked me out, that I had nowhere to go. Agnes listened in silence, then took my hand, pressed my palm against my belly, and said, "Whatever that man says, this baby knows the sound of your heart. Stay calm for her. The rest we will fight tomorrow. Fight." I hadn't realized until then that some part of me still wanted to beg the next morning. The story was everywhere, not the truth. The story, billionaire philanthropist questions paternity of unborn child. By society pages ran grainy photos of me leaving the gala. Blogs called me mysterious, manipulative, calculating. Anonymous sources claimed Damien had long suspected an affair. Someone leaked that I came from humble circumstances, as if poverty itself were motive. Sabrina, of course, gave no interviews, but one article quoted a close source within the Veil organization saying, Damien had been devastated by his wife's deceit. Deceit, a lie repeated with enough money behind it, begins to dress like truth. By noon my work email at St. Anne's was full of messages ranging from concern to voyeurism. The hospital director, kind but nervous, suggested I take an indefinite leave until the media storm settled. Translation: wealthy donors linked to Damien were already making calls by evening. My joint credit cards had been frozen. The next day, my phone service was briefly interrupted, and when I contacted Damien's office to ask for my prenatal insurance information, I was told future medical expenses would be evaluated after paternity confirmation. That was when rage finally arrived. Not wild rage. Not the kind that burns hot and fast. The kind that settles like iron in the spine. Because I could survive humiliation, I could survive heartbreak. But a man who could use his unborn child as leverage while she was still under her mother's heart was not simply wounded. He was dangerous. So I stopped crying, and I started remembering. When people talked about Damien Vale, they spoke in broad, admiring terms. Visionary, builder, provider. He had inherited a real estate empire from his father and doubled it before he turned 40. He restored historic hotels, funded children's wings in hospitals, appeared on magazine covers in dark suits with a kind of smile that made journalists lazy. He knew how to listen in rooms where listening was power. He knew how to make a waitress feel seen and a senator feel important. He knew when to be generous and when to let silence intimidate. He had spent so many years being admired that eventually he came to believe admiration meant moral authority. But the Damien I knew had fault lines under the marble. He hated being contradicted. He kept kindness like currency, distributing it where it bored loyalty. He loved his children genuinely, fiercely, but even there, control had roots. Their schools, their clothes, their schedules, their future spouses, if Celeste had her way. He believed protection and ownership were almost the same thing. When things slipped beyond his understanding, he didn't lean closer. He tightened his grip, and over the past year his grip had gotten tighter. I think it started when I became pregnant. That should sound backward. Pregnancy's supposed to soften. Some men make them gentler. But in Damien, it woke something frightened and possessive. At first it looked like devotion. He rescheduled meetings to drive me to appointments. He hired a nutritionist I didn't ask for. He insisted I stop working. By the 6th month, he had a nursery designed before we knew the baby's sex. He kissed my stomach every night and told our daughter she would never know a day without protection. But beneath that tenderness was panic. I saw it when a male doctor entered the room and Damien's jaw hardened. I saw it when I took too long answering texts. I saw it when he asked casual questions that were not casual at all. Who was at the prenatal class? Why did Dr. Adrian Lewis smile at you like that? Why did you delete that message from your phone? Why are you so insistent on going to your old neighborhood alone? At first I answered patiently because I thought fear was talking. Damien had been betrayed once before, or at least that was the story. Vanessa, his first wife, glamorous and impossible, had left him emotionally long before the divorce papers were signed. She had cheated in whispers, not in ways he could prove publicly, and by the time he gathered enough evidence to end the marriage, he was a man humiliated in private but determined never to appear broken in public. That was how he told it. That was how Celeste told it. That was how society told it that Vanessa had hurt him. So Alina must understand him. That was the unspoken contract. Everyone expected me to honor, and I tried. God, I tried. I loved those children, like they had grown under my own ribs. Ava, 13 and watchful, who pretended she didn't need anyone while quietly saving the birthday cards I wrote her. Mason, 10, loud and warm, who once announced at school that his stepmother made grilled cheese like it could heal emotional damage. Theo, 7, still young enough to fall asleep against my shoulder during movies. I learned the shape of their fears. I sat through fevers and spelling tests and tears over Vanessa's broken promises. I kept extra socks in my car. I knew who hated peas and who needed the hallway light on. I never tried to replace their mother. I only tried to be the place they could rest when our love turned inconsistent. And maybe that was part of why Damien's accusation cut so deep, because I hadn't only loved him, I had built myself into the empty spaces of his family. For 3 days, Damien did not contact me directly. Everything came through lawyers. The petition was filed in family court with humiliating speed, paternity challenge, asset protection, temporary marital separation pending results. His attorney, Martin Quill, requested that because the unborn child might affect existing trust distributions to Damien's 3 children, a full comparative family DNA panel should be ordered to settle inheritance implications in one procedure. When Agnes read that line aloud over the kitchen table, she lowered the paper and squinted at me. What does that mean? It means, I said slowly, he wants the baby tested against his DNA and likely wants the court to treat it like a trust matter, not just a marriage matter. Agnes frowned. On the other children, I looked again. Damien's legal team was requesting buccal samples from Ava Mason, and Theo was part of lineage documentation for future trust restructuring. They framed it as standard clarification because a 4th child would alter percentages. I should have found that insulting. Instead, something cold moved through me, not because I suspected what the results would show. I didn't, not then, but because it told me Damien's mind was not fixed on truth. It was fixed on ownership, on bloodlines, on percentages, on reducing children to legal proof and wives to financial threats. That afternoon I got my first direct message from him, not a call, not an apology for the gala, not concern for the stress on the baby, a single text. If you cooperate quickly, this won't become uglier than it already is. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. Then I typed back, it already is. He didn't answer. The days that followed taught me how quickly the world sorts women into believable and disposable. People who had once praised my patience began asking strange, invasive questions. A former bored wife called to say, in a syrupy voice, that if there was someone else, perhaps honesty would help everyone heal. A blogger posted screenshots of me having coffee with Dr. Adrian Lewis from my prenatal clinic, calling him my mystery companion. He was my obstetrician, and the photo had clearly been taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. Someone leaked that Damien had fertility issues. Someone else claimed I had known this and sought alternatives. Alternatives. If my daughter were a Stratia. And through all of it, the one thing that hurt almost as much as Damien's accusation was not hearing from the children. At first I told myself he was protecting them from media, then I realized he was protecting his version of events. On the 5th night, Ava called me from a blocked number. I recognized her silence before her voice, Elena. My throat closed instantly. Hi, sweetheart. There was a rustling sound, maybe blankets, maybe a closet door. She was hiding to make the call. Dad said you needed space. I shut my eyes. Agnes was across the room, watching me carefully over a cup of tea. I didn't choose space. Ava was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she whispered, Theo cries at night. That nearly broke me. Is Mason okay? He punched a wall because Grandma said you were a liar. My hand flew to my mouth. And me, Ava said, her voice suddenly older than 13. What am I supposed to think? The truth. I wanted to say believe me. Come to me. Remember every school pickup, every fever, every bedtime story. Every time I stayed when other people left. But children should not be handed adult wars like weapons. So I swallowed my grief and said, you're supposed to remember how I have loved you. You're supposed to know that I would never lie to hurt this family. Ava inhaled Shakale Y. Then she said the sentence that changed the temperature of the whole story. Grandma was smiling after the gala. I said nothing. Ava lowered her voice even more. Not when everyone was looking. In the car, I saw her, and when Dad got home, Sabrina was there. Grandma said, "Now we can clean this up before the baby arrives." My fingers tightened around the phone so hard they hurt. Ava, did anyone hear you call me? No. Listen to me. Delete this number after we hang up. And if you feel scared, call Agnes's house. I'll text you the number from a different phone. You think something's wrong? Yes, I thought. More than one thing. But I only said, I think grown-ups sometimes tell themselves ugly things are necessary. That doesn't make them true. After we hung up, I sat motionless for a full minute. Agnes finally asked, "What is it?" I looked at her. I think this was arranged. She nodded as if she had suspected it already, then stopped, waiting for fairness and prepare for proof. I did have one advantage Damien had forgotten. Before I became Alina Vale, wife of a powerful man, I had been Alina Hart, daughter of Gabriel Hart. Most people outside certain medical and philanthropic circles did not connect the names because my father had never chased publicity. But Gabriel Hart had founded Hartwell Genomics, a private diagnostic research company specializing in hereditary disease screening and chain-of-custody legal testing. After he died, his shares passed to me. I never talked about it because I had no interest in using inheritance as identity. I still worked at the hospital. I still drove my old sedan until Damien insisted on replacing it. Wealth that arrives through grief does not feel like glory. It feels like an echo. Damien knew my father had been in medicine. That was the phrase he used. He had never cared to understand the details. Celeste cared even less. In their minds, my background remained modest because I dressed simply, avoided social competition, and never leveraged what I had. If Damien had ever looked deeper, he would have discovered that I sat on Hartwell's quiet governing board and still had legal authority over independent testing partnerships. Hadn't hidden it from him exactly. He had simply never asked the questions that would reveal why I existed beyond the role he assigned me. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I wore a cream dress, flat shoes, and no jewelry except my father's watch. Damien arrived in charcoal gray with Martin Quill at his side and Sabrina behind them carrying documents. He did not look at my stomach. He did not ask how the baby was. He did not ask where I had been staying. He looked at me with practiced indifference, which somehow hurt more than open anger. Then he noticed who was walking beside me. Julian Hartwell, 72 years old, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and one of the founding legal trustees of Hartwell Genomics. He had been my father's best friend and had known me since I was 10. Damien's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Martin recognized Julian immediately. So did the judge. The hearing was brief. Damien's team argued for immediate testing through an elite private lab that frequently handled their corporate health contracts. Julian rose and objected on conflict grounds, then suggested a court-approved independent facility with documented legal integrity. Which facility? The judge asked. Julian glanced at me first, and when I nodded, he said, Hartwell Genomics. You could almost hear Damien rearranging his assumptions in real time. He turned to me fully for the first time in days. Hartwell. I met his gaze. My father's company. For the first time since the gala, he looked uncertain. Celeste, seated behind him, went rigid. Martin tried to object, but the judge seemed almost relieved to have a reputable neutral option with impeccable legal standing. Hartwell was approved. Buccal sampling was scheduled for all parties, including the children, under court observation. When we stepped into the hallway afterward, Damien caught my arm. Not hard, just enough to stop me. I looked down at his hand until he let go. Never mention this, he said. You never asked. His jaw flexed. So now you want to make a spectacle? I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because rich men often confuse losing control with being attacked. You did that already, I said softly. I'm just making sure this time the truth is invited. I walked away before he could answer. That should have felt like victory, instead of felt like grief with structure. Because once upon a time, the man standing in that hallway had kissed my forehead in a hospital corridor after our first miscarriage and whispered, We'll survive this, together. There is no clean way to watch love rot. DNA testing is a quiet process for something that can explode entire lives. Cotton swabs, sign forms, witnessed seals, labels printed in black ink. one sample after another. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just procedury, and yet the tension in that sterile collection room felt thick enough to choke on. Ava sat very still, trying to act older than she was. Mason kept glancing between Damien and me with anger he didn't know how to place. Theo asked if the swab would hurt, and looked relieved when the technician smiled. I wanted to gather all three of them against me and say, none of this is your fault. But I had no right to create more confusion in a room already full of betrayal. Vanessa arrived late wearing white, as if she were attending a luncheon instead of the legal dismantling of a family. If Damien was marble, Vanessa was flame. Beautiful in a way that asked to be watched. She bent to kiss the children, barely looked at me, then gave Damien a sorrowful expression, so polished it might as well have been rehearsed. This is so unnecessary, she murmured. The children shouldn't be dragged through your marital issues. I watched Damien absorb the sentence without protests. Of course he did. Vanessa had spent years mastering the art of wounding without fingerprints. Sabrina hovered near the doorway with a tablet. Celeste stood beside Damien in pale blue, one hand wrapped around a handkerchief she never used. When it was my turn, the technician explained the procedure as if I had never heard it before. I nodded, let her swab the inside of my cheek, and I tried not to look at Damien, but I felt his eyes on me, not loving, not warm, searching, maybe for guilt, maybe for fear, maybe for the expression that would prove him right. I gave him none results. Because of the legal urgency and the advanced prenatal component, were expected within 10 days, 10 days, 10 days, in which rumor thickened. Public sympathy tilted toward Damien, and private reality began to crack in places no one else could yet. See, Ava called twice more, once to tell me Theo had started sleeping with one of my old scarves because it smelled like me. Once to tell me Sabrina and Celeste had been in Damien's study with old files from the trust. On the second call, Ava sounded frightened. I heard Grandma say if the percentages change, everything changes. What percentages? I don't know. Dad got angry and told them both to stop talking in front of us. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I feared the baby's result. I knew the truth there. I knew whose daughter she was. What kept me awake was the sense that this story had started long before the gala, that Damien's accusation was only the latest symptom of a deeper sickness in that family. One built on image, inheritance, and lies maintained because they were convenient. On the fourth day of waiting, Dr. Adrian Lewis called to check on my blood pressure because stress levels in late pregnancy worried him. He had the calm voice of a man who had spent years talking people down from cliffs they could not always see. Your numbers were high last visit, he said. You need rest. I'll rest when my husband stops trying to legally erase my child. There was a pause on the line. Alana, forgive me for saying this, but I think you're underestimating how much this has affected you physically. He was right. My ankles were swollen. Sleep came in broken pieces. The baby moved constantly, as if reacting to adrenaline she did not deserve. Agnes had started taking my phone away at night. Julian checked in every morning. And still I functioned, like a woman gripping the edge of a floodplain, refusing to be carried off. And on the sixth day, another crack opened. Mason showed up at Agnes's gate. He had ridden his bike nearly 4 miles. When I saw him through the kitchen window, helmet, crooked eyes red, I was outside before Agnes could stop me. He almost crashed the bike jumping off it. Are you really having someone else's baby? Children do not ask devastating questions gently. They ask them as if truth can be yanked free by force. I knelt as much as my belly allowed. No. He searched my face the way children do when their world no longer makes sense. Dad said he has proof. Then why is there still a test? That hit him. I saw it. His mouth trembled. Grandma says some women trap men. Agnes muttered something in Spanish behind me that sounded like a prayer and a curse combined. I reached for Mason's shoulders. Listen to me. Adults can be wrong. Even adults you love. Especially when they're angry. He swallowed hard. Theo thinks you left because of him. Pain shot straight through me. No, never because of him. Never because of you. None of this is because of any of you. Mason nodded like he wanted to believe me but didn't know where to put that belief yet. Then he did something that nearly undid me. He stepped forward and hugged me carefully around the sides, avoiding my belly. I miss your pancakes, he whispered. I laughed and cried at the same time. Agnes fed him cookies and called Julian, who called Damien, who arrived 40 minutes. Later, with a face like thunder, he stormed into the yard prepared for battle. then stopped when he saw Mason at Agnes's table eating cookies and Theo's favorite dinosaur sticker on my fridge. His eyes moved over the small guest house, the faded curtains, the potted basil by the window, the pile of prenatal books Agnes had stacked beside my chair. I think it was the first time he had truly pictured where I had landed after he'd locked me out. He didn't apologize. He looked at Mason and said, "We are leaving." Mason shook his head. "I came on my own." "That is not the point." "No," Mason snapped, tears filling his eyes. "The point is you won't tell us anything except that Elena lied, and Grandma keeps talking like the baby is poison." The whole yard went still. Damien looked at me then, as if somehow I had orchestrated his son's pain as part of a strategy. That look made something final loosen inside me. He turned back to Mason. "Get your bike." Mason wiped his face and obeyed, because children still obey even when their hearts are confused. Before Damien left, he paused near the gate. For a second, I thought he might say my name with softness in it, might ask if I needed anything, might notice how pale I was. Instead he said, "You should have stayed at the hotel." I stared at him. "You should have spoken to me before putting me on a stage." His face hardened. "You haven't denied seeing Adrian outside work," he said. I almost laughed again. "You mean my obstetrician?" "I mean the man photographed with you 3 times. I shook my head slowly. "This is what you built your certainty on. A doctor walking me to my car after appointments because your wife was too dizzy to drive." His eyes shifted, just slightly. It was enough to tell me he did not have much more than insinuation and fear. No confession, no witness, no real proof. Just suspicion fed until it dressed itself as conviction. "Then the test will clear you," he said. "No," I replied. "It will expose you." He left without another word. When the results came, they did not go first to Damien. They went to the court, the supervising attorneys, and Hartwell's legal genetics director under sealed review because of the expanded comparative panel. Julian called at 7:12 in the morning. "Are you sitting down?" My body went cold. "Is the baby okay?" He exhaled. "The baby is his." I closed my eyes and pressed a hand over my stomach. Relief flooded me so hard it almost hurt. I knew it. There's more. Something in his tone changed the air in the room. Agnes, who had been buttering toast, stopped moving. "What more?" Elena Julian said carefully. "The comparative results exclude Damien as the biological father of Ava Mason and Thea." The kitchen disappeared around me, not literally. I still saw the yellow curtains, the chipped sugar bowl, Agnes's hand gripping the knife handle, but everything dropped several feet away from my body, as if the news had altered gravity. "All 3, I whispered yes. That word entered the room like a bomb with no smoke. All 3, not one, not a lab anomaly, not a possibility requiring delicate interpretation. All 3. I sat very slowly because my legs no longer trusted themselves. Agnes made the sign of the cross. Julian continued in the careful tone of it. "Manhandling lit explosives. There will need to be verification because these consequences are severe, but the chain of custody is flawless. The markers are conclusive." I could barely speak. "Does Damien know?" "He will within the hour." He did know within the hour. And by noon, the world had cracked. I was not there when he received the report, but I heard enough from Martin Quill later, and from Ava much later, to piece it together. Damien had gone into his study expecting vindication. Celeste was with him. Sabrina was there too, because Sabrina always managed to position herself near power when it was about to erupt. Martin opened the file, read the fetal paternity result first, and according to Ava, there was 1 full second in which Damien just stood there, stunned, before his face strained of color. Then Martin kept reading. By the time he got to Thea, exclusion markers, Celeste had sat down. Vanessa called in immediately, arrived, insisting there had to be a mistake. She demanded another lab, another review, another explanation. But biology, once it has spoken in that voice, is not easily shouted over. And suddenly the man who had destroyed his pregnant wife in public to protect his precious bloodline was staring at the collapse of the bloodline he had worshipped for 13 years. That should have satisfied me in some dark corner of human instinct. Maybe it did, but satisfaction was smaller than the grief, because whatever else those results meant. 3 children I loved were about to learn that the adults around them had built their lives on a lie. The emergency hearing was moved up. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the steps. Cameras turned every arrival into spectacle. This time, when I stepped from Julian's car, no one shouted mistress or Freud. Now the questions were messier. Mrs. Vale, did your husband falsely accuse you? Is it true the older children are not biologically his? Did you know about the company connection? Will there be criminal charges for defamation? I said nothing. Inside, Damien looked like a man who had aged 10 years and 10 days. He still wore an expensive suit. His hair was still perfectly cut. His watch still cost more than some people's cars. But the invincible polish was gone. Grief had a way of stripping wealth down to skin. Vanessa sat 2 rows behind him in sunglasses, though we were indoors. Celeste looked brittle. Sabrina was absent. I took my seat and felt my daughter move, a strong rolling motion under my ribs, as if reminding me she was still here, still alive, still innocent of all this ruin. The judge reviewed the findings formally. My unborn child was conclusively Damien's biological daughter. The court admonished both parties that public conduct affecting maternal stress during pregnancy could influence later custody considerations. Martin Quill looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Then the judge addressed the comparative results involving the older children, because those children were minors and not direct subjects of the marital petition. The court moved carefully, but there was no avoiding the fact that the expanded testing Damien's own team had requested had returned devastating information. Additional confidential family proceedings would be necessary. The trust petition was frozen. Emergency counseling for the children was recommended. Public dissemination of their results was heavily restricted. Legally, it was all very controlled. Emotionally, it was carnage. When the hearing ended, Damien stood as if he might approach me, then dinned him in single quotes. Vanessa tried to leave through a side exit and was intercepted by Martin. Celeste remained seated, staring straight ahead. I thought that might be the end of surprises for the day. I was wrong, because as I reached the hallway, a woman I recognized only faintly stepped out from near the elevators. Her name was Cho. She had once worked as a senior executive assistant in Damien's office, years before Sabrina. I remembered her from old foundation photos and one awkward holiday party where she had quietly refilled everyone's glasses while Vanessa flirted with a gallery owner in the corner. Maribel looked terrified. I need to speak to you, she said. Julian immediately moved between us, but Maribel lifted both hands. Not to hurt her, please. I don't have much time before they realize I'm here. Julian looked at me. I nodded. We stepped into an empty conference room off the hallway. Maribel closed the door and turned to me with tears already in her eyes. I should have spoken years ago. My heartbeat quickened. About what? She swallowed. When Ava was born, there was already suspicion. Every nerve in my body sharpened. What suspicion? Maribel looked at the floor. Damien's father had arranged private blood work because there was a medical issue after the delivery. Not a full legal test, just enough to raise concern. Celeste found the report before Damien saw it. The room seemed to tilt. She hid it, Maribel whispered, as she told me to destroy the copy and cancel the follow-up. She said the timing would ruin the family during a merger, and that Damien didn't need uncertainty while Vanessa was recovering. I stared at her. Maribel's face crumpled. I was young. I worked for them. I was afraid. Then later, there were more reasons to suspect, especially with Mason. I've told myself it wasn't my place. Julian's expression had turned to stone. Why are you telling us now? He asked. Because Sabrina started bragging. Maribel wiped her eyes. She was drunk 2 nights ago. She said Celeste finally got rid of the gold digger, and that Damien was too blind to see the wrong woman had been betraying him for years. Felt sick. Wrong woman. Not that he had been betrayed by one, and falsely accused another. That the wrong target had been publicly destroyed. Maribel reached into her bag and slid a flash drive across the table. I kept backups of old correspondence. I don't know everything that's on there anymore, but some emails survived. If Celeste buried those early concerns and still helped paint you as a liar, you deserve to know. My hand hovered over the drive before I picked it up. It was so small, so light, and it held enough to drown a dynasty. The emails took hours to verify, but once Hartwell's forensic team and Julian's legal contacts reviewed them, the pictures sharpened into something even uglier than suspicion. Years ago, after Ava's birth, a compatibility panel had indeed raised paternity concerns. Not conclusive, but troubling enough to warrant follow-up. Celeste had intercepted it. Her instructions in the email were cold, practical, and unmistakable. No further action. Mr. Vale is not to be distressed with speculative nonsense. Mrs. Vale and the child remain under family protection. This matter's closed at the time. Mrs. Vale had been Vanessa. The second layer was newer. Messages between Celeste and Sabrina over the past 3 months showed a coordinated campaign of surveillance against me. Selective screenshots of innocuous communications and deliberate interpretation of every prenatal appointment. Delayed reply and private errand as suspicious. Sabrina had even hired the photographer who took the images of me with Adrian. In one message, Celeste wrote, "Damien only needs certainty long enough to act. Doubt in later if you must." Read that sentence slowly enough and you can hear the moral collapse inside it. They did not care whether I was guilty. They cared whether Damien could be provoked into treating me as guilty before the baby arrived. Why? Because Celeste feared what a new child would mean. Not emotionally, financially, symbolically. A daughter with me would split Damien's attention, adjust the trust, shift influence away from Vanessa's children, and permanently secure my place in the family. Celeste could tolerate me as a temporary wife, a warm body smoothing domestic edges. She could not tolerate me as the mother of a confirmed veil heir. So she weaponized his worst fear, and he let her. That evening, Damien finally came to Agnes's house. He came alone, don't lawyer, no assistant, no driver. He looked like hell. Agnes opened the door, took one look at him and said, "You have 5 minutes before I call every woman in this neighborhood to remove you by force." He nodded like a man who knew he deserved worse. I was sitting in the small living room with my feet elevated. When he stepped inside, our daughter moved sharply beneath my skin, and instinctively I covered my belly. That gesture almost broke him. He stopped 3 feet away, his eyes fixed on my hand over the child he had denied. "Alina," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. I had imagined this moment a dozen different ways while crying into Agnes's pillow at night. In some versions I screamed. In some I slapped him. In some, I let him fall to pieces and watched with the cold satisfaction he had earned. But when the moment came, I simply felt tired, a tiredness deeper than sleep. "Why are you here?" He swallowed, to say I was wrong. A bitter smile touched my mouth. "That's a very small sentence for what you did." His eyes filled instantly, and I think that startled both of us. Damien was not a man who cried easily in front of other people. Perhaps not at all. Yet, there he stood, grief cracking through control. "I know," he whispered. "I know." Oh. He looked around the room, at the cheap lamp, the crocheted blanket, the prenatal vitamins on the side table, the softness Agnes had stitched around my exile, and shame moved visibly through him. I thought he stopped, tried. Again. No, that's not true. I didn't think I decided. And once I decided, I turned everything into proof. There it was. The ugliest kind of confession. Not I was deceived. Not I made a mistake. I chose a story and forced reality to fit inside it. I held his gaze. "You accused me in public. You froze my money. You locked me out of my home." "Our home?" he whispered. "Not when I needed it." He flinched. "I know. Do you?" My voice rose for the first time. "Do you know what it feels like to stand outside your own front door carrying your husband's child and realize he changed the locks before telling you you were worthless? Do you know what it feels like to hear women discuss your unborn baby, like she's a legal contamination? Do you know what Theo's scarf smells like after he cries himself to sleep because he thinks I left him?" He covered his face with one hand and bowed his head. I had never seen him look smaller. Then he said the words I had not expected. "My father knew." I went still. He dropped his hand. "Not everything, but enough to suspect." Martin found old notes after the hearing. My father wanted to revisit concerns about Ava years ago. He was already sick by then. Mother shut it down. His mouth tightened with disgust. She preserved the family image. I worshipped that image. I let her teach me that blood was truth and appearances were honor. He laughed once, hollowly, and I destroyed the only woman who had never lied to me. I stared at him. This was a man standing in the wreckage of his own mind, seeing its architecture for the first time. "I still love those children," he said, and tears finally fell. "That's the part I don't know how to survive." My anger wavered then, not because he deserved comfort, but because love and betrayal had become too tangled to separate cleanly. "I know," I said quietly, "and they still love you." He looked up sharply, as if he hadn't considered he might still be wanted by the ones whose biology had just abandoned him. Men like Damien often confuse blood with belonging until life rips the confusion apart. Took a breath. Vanessa admitted enough to destroy us. Not names, not all of them, but enough. He laughed again, harsher. "She said she always knew I'd prefer certainty over truth. She said that made me easy to manage." I closed my eyes. Of course she had. Women like Vanessa don't merely betray, they study the weaknesses. Betrayal can hide inside. And Sabrina, I asked. His face hardened. Gone. Legal action pending. And Celeste? That question took longer. When he finally answered, his voice was flat. My mother is no longer welcome in my house. I looked at him for a long moment, then I said, it still isn't enough. He nodded immediately, tears sliding down without restraint now. I know. This time he did know. Because the damage was not only factual, it was sacred. He had not simply doubted me. He had turned the most vulnerable season of my life into a public trial and stood at the center of it like a judge. There are apologies that can mend accidents. This was not an accident. It was character revealed under pressure. Don't want revenge, I said at last. I want distance. I want peace for this baby. I want legal protection from your family. And I want those children in therapy before another adult poisons them with inherited pride. He nodded after every sentence like a man taking blows. He would not dodge. You'll have all of it. I want the divorce handled quietly. That landed harder than anything else. He shut his eyes. When he opened them again, there was no argument in them, only devastation. If that is what you need. It is. He looked at my stomach then, really looked, and his voice became a whisper. Can I ask? Is she all right? I should have hated how that tenderness still touched me. She's strong, I said. A tear slid down his cheek, like her mother. He left after that. Not because I forgave him, not because the scene ended cleanly, but because there was nothing left to say that could turn back time. And childbirth was getting closer, whether our marriage survived or not. The next week should have been calmer. Instead, my body decided it had carried enough stress. I went into labor at 36 weeks. It started in the middle of the night, with a cramp so sharp it cut through sleep like glass. Agnes was at my bedside before I fully sat up. By the time Dr. Adrian confirmed my contractions were real and too close together to ignore, I was shaking from pain and exhaustion. Agnes called Julian. Julian called Damien. I didn't know that until later. All I knew was that the hospital lights were too bright. My back felt like it was splitting open, and every nurse's sympathetic look made me want to either cry or scream. Labor has a way of stripping life down to the body's oldest truths. Breathe, push, endure, survive. At some point between contractions, I heard raised voices outside the room. Then Damien was there. I had not asked for him, but he came in, not as the man from the gala, not as the emperor of a destroyed public image, just as a father with terror written all over him. His suit jacket was gone. His tie was loose. His face was pale. Do you want me out? He asked immediately. I should have said yes. I almost did. Then another contraction hit, and I gripped the rail hard enough to blanch my knuckles. He moved without thinking, bracing my shoulders while the nurse adjusted my monitors. For one strange second, muscle memory overtook heartbreak. His hand knew where my back hurt. My body knew the shape of his steadiness from another life. When the contraction passed, I was crying. Not from pain alone, from grief at the fact that comfort could still arrive in a hand I no longer trusted. Stay until she's born, I whispered. He bowed his head once. I'm here. Labor stretched for hours. Pain rearranges time. It turns minutes into cliffs. It makes you ancient and newborn at once. Damien stayed through all of it. Silent when silence helped. Steady when I needed something to grip. He did not make speeches. He did not beg for another chance. He fetched water, signed a blood consent when my levels dipped, pressed a cool cloth to my forehead, and looked more afraid than I had ever seen him. At one point, when the room dimmed and the machines blurred, I heard him murmur near my ear, I am so sorry, Elena. Not loud, not performative. A confession to the woman and child he had nearly lost at once, and maybe that mattered. Not enough to save a marriage, but enough that when our daughter finally arrived, pink and furious and impossibly alive, and her cry tore through the room like the first honest sound after months of lies, I turned my head and let him see her before anyone else. He made a sound then. I will never forget. It was not a sob exactly. It was what happens when a man hears grace after believing he deserved only judgment. She's beautiful, he whispered. The nurse laid her on my chest, and the whole world narrowed to warmth. Damp curls, tiny fists, and the unbelievable weight of love. I counted fingers. I kissed her forehead. I cried into her hair. Damien stood beside us with tears running unchecked down his face. What's her name? The nurse asked softly. I looked at my daughter, then at the man who had broken my heart and still somehow shared this miracle, Clara. I said it had been my grandmother's name. It meant bright, clear, dark, the kind of truth that finally cannot be smothered. Damien repeated it like prayer, Clara, for 2 days. The hospital room became a neutral country between the ruins and whatever came next. Ava, Mason, and Theo visited with Julian first, then Damien. There was fear in all three of them, but Clara had a way of quieting rooms just by existing. Theo stared at her like she was moonlight. Mason asked if babies always looked like wrinkled philosophers. Ava cried when she held her and whispered, "She has your mouth." I watched those children look at my daughter not as a threat to inheritance, not as proof of scandal, but as a baby, their sister, the innocent center of a storm adults had manufactured. And I knew then that, whatever blood had revealed, love would have to work harder than ever to keep them from becoming casualties. Vanessa did not come. Celeste tried once. I refused to see her. She sent flowers anyway. White lilies, expensive, fragrant, impossible to ignore. I had the nurse remove them. 3 weeks later, the apology Damien owed me became public. Not because I requested spectacle. I would have preferred silence forever. But defamation lawyers, board presser, and the simple fact that he had accused me in a ballroom full of witnesses made a private correction impossible. His statement was delivered at a press conference outside Vale Foundation headquarters, with no wife at his side. This time, and no mother in the front row, he admitted that he had falsely accused me of infidelity and caused severe personal harm. He confirmed that Clara was his daughter. He announced he was stepping back temporarily from public duties, had terminated certain employees involved in misconduct, and asked for privacy for all minor children affected by the matter. Reporters shouted questions about Vanessa, about Celeste, about the trust, about whether he would contest the divorce. He answered only one in full. Mrs. Vale showed dignity and a cruelty she did not deserve. Any suffering she endured is mine to answer for, not hers to explain. I watched the clip in Agnes's living room while Clara slept against my chest. When it ended, Agnes looked at me and asked, "Did it help?" I thought about the gala, the locked door, the children's tears, the labor room, the way Damien had stared at Clara as if asking permission to love what he had almost destroyed a little. I said, "It was the truth, not because words repaired the past, but because public lies should sometimes be forced to kneel where they first tried to reign." The divorce was finalized 4 months later. I kept my maiden name and full primary custody of Clara, with structured visitation that grew gradually as long as Damien maintained counseling and respected boundaries. He agreed to all of it without a fight. He also funded private therapy for Ava, Mason, and Theo. Though in the beginning Ava refused to speak in sessions and Mason only talked about soccer, Theo, unsurprisingly, asked whether fathers could stop being fathers if blood said so. That question haunted everyone. Damien answered it the only decent way he could. "No," he told them, "not if love has anything to say about it." He legally remained their father, not out of pride, not out of denial, out of the years already lived. People on the outside argued about whether he was foolish, whether he should cut ties, whether Vanessa had trapped him, whether children represented humiliation. People who say such things understand nothing. A child is not less held because science changes its label. A bedtime story told 100 times does not disappear because a lab report arrives. Love is not always born from blood. Sometimes blood is the least impressive thing about a family. That did not make Damien noble. It made him finally human. As for Celeste, society handled her the way it always handles elegant women whose cruelty becomes undeniable, not with dramatic exile, with chilly withdrawal, fewer invitations, more whispers. Her name still opened doors, but not as warmly. The emails became impossible to dismiss once legal discovery touched them. She was never charged criminally, but she lost access to the grandchildren for a long season and, more devastating to her, lost influence over their inner life. Image had been her religion. Exposure was its punishment. Sabrina disappeared into a settlement. She could not publicly discuss. Vanessa moved to another state for a while, then returned when attention cooled, as people like her often do. The children saw her on their own terms. With supervision at first, she remained what she had always been, magnetic, unreliable, unable to love without also consuming. And me. I moved into a small sunlit house near the river with a front porch, 2 lemon trees, and enough room for Clara's crib beside my bed. Hartwell's board asked if I would take a more active role in the Foundation's maternal health initiatives, and for the first time, I said yes. Not because I wanted power, because I had learned how many women are made vulnerable by men who control money, medicine, and narrative all at once. I wanted to build places where being pregnant did not mean being defenseless. Agnes became family so permanently that no legal language could define it. She was at Clara's first bath, first fever, first laugh, first Christmas. Julian cried at the christening and pretended dust had gotten in his eye. Ava started babysitting sometimes and pretending she was only there for the snacks. Mason taught Clara to make obnoxious car sounds before she could form full words. Theo believed with total sincerity that Clara understood his whispered stories about dinosaurs and Damien. He changed, not all at once, not into a saint. Pain rarely transforms people that cleanly. It humbles them in patches. It leaves scars where vanity used to sit. He sold the penthouse. Quietly, he moved into a townhouse closer to the children's school. He stopped attending events that required a polished wife smiling beside him. He went to therapy. He missed one visitation when Clara was 7 months old because he had a panic episode after seeing a father-daughter dance photo from a charity file. He called me himself to admit it, voice shaking, and asked to reschedule instead of sending an assistant. That mattered more than grand gestures ever had. Sometimes, when he came to pick Clara up, there would be a moment on the porch where our old life flickered between us like a ghost. The memory of laughter in kitchens, of hands meeting in the dark, of the life we had almost continued if he had chosen trust instead of spectacle. But almost is not a home, and regret is not repair. One autumn afternoon, nearly 2 years after the gala, I took Clara to the park wearing a red coat and tiny boots she hated. The leaves had turned amber and gold. Theo was chasing pigeons. Mason was kicking a soccer ball. Ava sat on a bench pretending not to monitor everyone at once. Damien stood near the swings with coffee in one hand and Clara's stuffed rabbit in the other because she had abandoned it in the grass. He looked up and saw me watching. For a second, Tom held not romantically, just honestly. He walked over and handed me the rabbit. She asked for you after her nap, he said. I smiled despite myself. She usually does. He nodded then, after a pause, he said, Ava got accepted into the art program she wanted. That's wonderful. She wanted to tell you first, but she was pretending to be cool. I laughed. So did he. The sound was softer now than I remembered, less certain, more earned. Then he looked at Clara, who was trying to feed a leaf to Theo, and said, you know, for a long time I thought justice would feel like winning. I waited. He exhaled slowly. It turns out justice often feels like seeing yourself clearly and having to live with what you find. That was the closest thing to a final confession he ever gave me. I appreciated it because it was true. He had lost what arrogance said was replaceable and learned. Too late, that trust is not. I glanced at him and said, clarity hurts. Yes, he replied, but it also ends the lie. We stood there in silence while the children laughed nearby, and then Clara turned, saw me, and ran with the unstable joy only toddlers possess. Arms up, face bright. Sure, she would be caught. And I caught her. Of course I did. I always would. That is, the thing men like Damien and women like Celeste never fully understood when they tried to turn my pregnancy into leverage. They thought motherhood made me weaker because it made me easier to wound. They thought the need to protect a child would force me into submission, silence, or dependence. They mistook tenderness for fragility. They mistook kindness for lack of power. But carrying life does not make a woman easier to erase. It reveals exactly how much she can survive while refusing to become cruel, and in the end, that was the real karma. Not that Damien's accusation boomeranged back onto his own past. Not that DNA exposed the children he worshipped as proof of his legacy were never his by blood. Not that Celeste lost her throne, or Vanessa lost her invisibility, or Sabrina lost her access to power. Those things were consequences. Necessary ones. But the real justice was simpler. The woman they tried to humiliate in public did not collapse. The child they tried to call illegitimate arrived radiant and loved. The family they tried to control with inheritance. An image had to love the hard way, stripped of illusion, and the man who once stood before a ballroom and declared my baby wasn't his, now spent every Thursday evening sitting on the floor of a small sunlit house, letting that same little girl put plastic crowns on his head while her brothers and sister laughed at him. He never got me back. That was part of the price. Some betrayals do not end in reconciliation. They end in understanding. He understood. I did too. And if you ask me whether he loved Clara, whether he loved Ava, and Mason and Theo after everything, whether broken people can still become better parents than they were spouses, I would tell you yes. Sometimes painfully, imperfectly, yes. But if you ask me whether I ever forgot that night in the ballroom, the microphone, the laughter in his voice, the locked door waiting for me before I even got home, I would tell you no. A woman can forgive, and still remember exactly where the blade entered. Memory is not bitterness. Sometimes it is wisdom. Sometimes it is the scar that keeps your daughter from growing up. Believing apologies erase patterns. Clara's older now. Old enough to ask questions in that fearless way children do. Why don't you and Daddy live together? Why does Grandma Celeste only visit with Aunt Agnes there? Why does Ava get sad on birthdays sometimes? When those questions come, I answer them. In pieces she can carry. Not lies, not the whole weight at once. Just enough truth to build a spine around her. Tell her, families can be complicated and still full of love. I tell her adults make mistakes, and some mistakes change everything. I tell her being chosen after the truth comes out matters more than being adored before it. And one day, when she is old enough to understand what happened before she was born, I will tell her the part that matters most, that her mother stood alone in a storm designed to shame her, and did not hand strangers the right to define her, that her father lost his way and, in losing it, finally saw the difference between ownership and love, that blood can reveal secrets, but character reveals destiny, and that on the worst night of my life, when the world tried to make me bow my head, I walked out carrying her inside, me like a promise no one else could touch. That is how this story ends. Not with the applause of a ballroom, not with society's approval, not with the restoration of a marriage. That should not have survived what it became. It ends with a little girl asleep upstairs. One hand curled around a stuffed rabbit, while moonlight spills across the floor of a peaceful home her mother built from the wreckage of public humiliation. It ends with 3 children who learned that being loved is bigger than being claimed. It ends with a man who finally understands that the cruelest sentence he ever spoke became the truth that undid his pride. And it ends with me. No longer Elena Vale, no longer the woman on stage waiting for permission to defend herself, but Elena Hart again, standing at my own window, hearing my daughter breathe in the next room, and knowing with a calm so deep it feels holy that justice did come, that it just didn't come dressed the way any of us expected. It came as exposure, it came as labor, it came as children choosing love over shame. It came as a public lie dragged into daylight until it shriveled. It came as a locked door that forced me to find a truer home. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the past drifts near enough to touch, I think back to the exact moment Damien raised that microphone and tried to hand me disgrace. As if it were mine to carry. He was wrong. The disgrace was never mine. It belonged to the people who confused cruelty with power, suspicion with wisdom, blood with worth. And when the truth finally arrived, it did what truth always does in the end. It kept the child, it shattered the lie, and it left the guilty standing in the ruins of the names they thought they owned.